Um, G'day everyone, thanks for joining us again. It's Woody and Westy here, another one of our little chats. How are you, Michael?
Good, buddy. How are you?
Yeah, really good, mate. The sun's out in Melbourne, which we haven't seen for a while, so every day the sun's out in Melbourne is a good day.
Yeah, sun's out here today. We've had some wild weather, but as we always joke about, it says it was 5 degrees, but it feels like 3. So, like we say, there's a bloke out there who does that job that sits out in the weather and says it feels like 3.
That's his job. Now, Michael, we're going to do something a little bit different today. We're going to talk about a specific issue, and that is getting around in a wheelchair.
Oh, great. Love it.
Okay, now I need to start off by explaining that you don't use a wheelchair, but
No,
you have had some experience of having to use a wheelchair. So can you just explain to me and to anyone that's listening how that came about?
Yeah, sure. I had to laugh as soon as you said wheelchairs because I was like, ugh. 8 wheelchairs. The start of last year, I broke one of my feet whilst out in the garden on a shovel. Long story, but I did break it, and I broke fractured what they call as the 5th metatarsal on the foot side of the foot, and I needed surgery. It was taking about a week for surgery to get booked in. So I was in a bit of a moon boot for starters, but me being me, as my wife Donna says, only you could do this. I was walking through the hallway on the moon boot and I tripped over the lamp cord and guess what? Broke the other foot, 5th metatarsal again. And the doctor said, you should go and buy a lottery ticket. I said, well, that's not very lucky. He said, it's amazing to break both feet, in that same spot. So, yeah, I had an operation about a week later on both feet and ended up in a wheelchair for over a month or 5 weeks or so. So, and didn't really love it, mate. Didn't really love it.
Yeah, well, as you know, mate, I've been in this thing for over 30 years now, so I've got a little bit more experience than you. Can you just tell me what is the first thing that you found about having to get around on wheels rather than having to use your feet?
I think the largest problem for me, the obstacle, was everything in my way. Everything that I would usually do on my feet was not accessible at a certain point. I couldn't get inside my house, without help. Couldn't get in the car without help. I couldn't access all parts of the house. And even to the point of, even getting outside, I found going up a little step inside the house, into the house was okay because I'd do a little bit of a wheel stand and push myself up. But going down, I found that I'd nosedive in with my feet and get stuck like on a pivot, and but yeah, I think that the access to where I would normally be able to access was a really hard part for me.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty lucky because when I got hurt, I went to a full-time rehab centre. So they actually took the time to teach me all of the skills that I needed to get around in a wheelchair. The best way to push it, the best way to turn it, how to get over little steps up and down. So, you didn't have that luxury. So you were pretty much given a wheelchair and said, there you go, work it out for yourself.
Exactly.
One of the biggest issues for me was not just the physical obstacles, but actually having to think about how I was going to get to places and, how I was going to get up a little step or into through a doorway. Did you have any experiences like that?
Oh, absolutely. There was not just doorways for width or anything. I could get through just about every room in the house with the width of the doorway, but it was where in some narrow rooms like our laundry, you might need to get something that was behind the door or something.
Yeah.
So you had to, I found that if you went in forward, you can't close the door. So I had to reverse in on this wheelchair, close it, get the thing in, and then of course my feet were out so far that I couldn't reach the door. So my wife Donna ended up buying a like a $5 little pickup, for the people
little grabber.
Can't bend, that little grab, and I used to grab the door handle with that and reverse up with one hand on the wheel, but spinning around like this, and it was a nightmare. But
well, you raise a good point there, because as much as we're having a bit of a laugh and a bit of a joke about it now, it does get frustrating for me. I mean, even having been in this thing for the time that I've been in it, I still get frustrated by some of the places that I can't get to in my wheelchair, some of the things that, I can't reach and can't lift. And, I do spend a lot of time by myself, so I don't always have the luxury of being able to ask someone to reach something, or, being able to ask someone to help me get in and out of a building somewhere. So, you can imagine that, the frustration does build up for someone that has to get around in a wheelchair.
We could all sit in a wheelchair and have a go at it. For example, even at one of your talks, say, oh yeah, gee, that must be hard. But I did have that 5 weeks, and you really don't get a real good understanding of how hard it must be until you've had 5 weeks in a wheelchair,
But I think that brings us back to why we both do what we do, Michael, because, I know what it's like to have to get around in a wheelchair for the last 30 years and probably for the next however many years. You know what it's like to live with, your mental health issues and your brain injury. So I think, the point that you're trying to make there is, if we can stop these things from happening, you don't have to experience some of the things that I have to live with on a daily basis, and you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, exactly. On a funny note, do you remember a video I did where I was trying to, for those that are watching and listening to this, is I went to see my specialist to see how my feet were going in a wheelchair, and he looked at them and said, look, you need to stay in a wheelchair for another couple of weeks. I said, no problem. And I was really busting for the loo for a whiz, so I thought, I'll go downstairs, through the lift and go to the toilet there, and there was a disabled sign there with a person in a wheelchair, and I thought, I was kind of, I felt like a fraud to go in there, but my wife was with me and she said, look, don't try and go in there. You won't fit into that door, and this is specifically for people like yourself right now that can't get around. It's better access. So I remember trying to get through that bloody door, and I'll tell you what, disabled toilet was it, because the toilet itself was disabled. It was just not, it wasn't fit for purpose, and do you think I could get through that door, It was so heavy trying to push the door, and I was pushing the wheels back on this and was trying to go in reverse, and again, against, specialist orders, I used my broken feet to push the door open so I could use these wheels, So, it's, it's funny, but on the other side, I said to my wife Donna, how do people in wheelchairs do this? How do they put up with this?
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
I suppose.
That's one of the things that I've noticed since my accident, Michael, is that, you know, a lot of these facilities that are supposedly, you know, accessible or wheelchair friendly, they're just not. And they might have, you know, specifications, engineering, you know, specifications, or architects' drawings that say, oh yeah, that works on paper. But in reality, it doesn't work. You know, that door that you mentioned is a perfect example. You know, that might look, it might be wide enough for a wheelchair. It might, you know, have the right sort of, you know, no step to get into the toilet. But the fact that some peanut has put a dirty, great big spring, return spring on the door that you've got to, you know, really push to get it open, it just doesn't work. But just while we're on the issue of toilets, one of the things that really pisses me off is people that use the wheelchair toilet that probably shouldn't be using it.
Yeah.
Like I said, I've been in this thing for 30 years. The amount of things that I've seen happen in wheelchair toilets, you would not believe. I've come across, you know, and this is again talking about mining. I went to a toilet one day and it was engaged. So I sat out the front of it and I could hear voices. There was like, you know, more than 3 or 4 voices. And the toilet's, you know, still engaged and I'm waiting and I'm busting to go to the loo. So anyhow, I knock on the door and the toilet opens and they open the door just a little bit and there's 4 or 5 guys that they're just flying out. So they're flying back from site and they're having a few beers in the wheelchair toilet. And it just frustrates me. And the other point that's probably worth making too, Michael, is look, I'm lucky because I have got some bowel and bladder control. So I know when I need to go to the toilet and, you know, I can go to the toilet normally. Other people with, you know, any sort of injury or even disability, they may not have the same bowel and bladder control. So, you know, when they need to go to the toilet, they need to go right then and right there. So, you know, if you're in there getting changed or you're doing your makeup or having a beer in a wheelchair toilet, just think of the person outside that's absolutely busting and doesn't have the control that they should have.
One. Do you remember that night we went out for a bite to eat?
Oh, yeah, I do.
So for people that are watching this, so James and I and his wife Vanessa are going out for a bite to eat that night. And if you can picture, it's pouring with rain and we go out to an outside part of the shopping centre and it's like a courtyard. And usually I'd imagine if it was a nice sunny day, it would be, or night, it would be beautiful to be sitting out there with a cold beer or wine and some nice food. But it was cold, it was windy, it was pouring with rain. But it didn't really hit me until I was in a wheelchair that I reflected back on that time where, so Vanessa and I, it was pouring with rain, we got to walk underneath the I suppose the roof line of the building so we didn't get wet. And the wheelchair ramp went straight into the open of the courtyard where it was pouring with rain, and the next ramp was on the other side to where you could get. So you were absolutely soaked by the time you got there. And, you know, again, we laughed at it at the time, and you were probably like that in your mind. But,
but
again,
I think from memory, Michael, there was only you and Vanessa were able to walk up, was it 2 or 3 steps? So, you know, it's only a height distance of maybe a foot and a half at the most. So, you know, you were able to walk up those 2 or 3 steps easily, whereas I had to go right out into the pouring rain, right around the back. And, it's all part of getting around on wheels.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think one of the other things that's worth mentioning, Michael, and you mentioned this before too, is getting in and out of the car. It's a lot. There's a lot more involved in getting in and out of the car if you have to use a wheelchair. I mean, for most of the people watching this, especially if you work in mining or construction, there's a lot of getting in and out of vehicles and getting in and out of pieces of machinery. Every time I have to get in and out of the car, or when you had to use your wheelchair, you have to physically transfer from your wheelchair into the car seat, and then you have to somehow work out how you're going to get the wheelchair either into the back of the car, or in my case, I pull my wheelchair apart and put it in the passenger side next to me. So, something that takes most people watching this, maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 seconds to do, it takes a lot longer to get a wheelchair in and out of the vehicle. Probably the one last story I do want to share with people, Michael, and I know you've heard this one before. I was out at a workplace years ago, and we get to the part that I really enjoy, where people get to ask you questions. And one of the guys in this session, he'd sat there and listened to my little story, and he must have been thinking about it, because he said, "Oh, Woody, can you tell us what's the worst thing about having to get around in a wheelchair?" And I think he probably thought that I was going to say, one of the things that we've already talked about. You can't reach things up high. You can't get up and down steps. But just prior to this session, I'd been out with one of my sons. My son was only young at the time, and I'd been out with one of my boys, and I had a pretty bad experience. I was out at one of the local parks, and I said to this bloke, I said, "Yeah, you know what, mate? One of the worst things about being in a wheelchair, dog shit."
Yes.
Because I'd been out with my son in a local park, and we're just wheeling across some grass, and some dog had done its business, and someone hadn't picked up after their dog, and I got dog shit all over my hands, all over my wheels, all over the side of my clothes. I mean, you know what it's like to get on your feet. Imagine getting it all over your hands. I had a bit of it wasn't very nice at the time, but looking back on it, again, it's just one of those funny things that I've got to put up with. So look, I think that's probably given people a bit of an idea of what it's like to get around in a wheelchair. Michael, I mean, you've experienced it. I'm still experiencing it. I think, like you said before, the best piece of advice that I can give to anyone is, look, think about some of the things that you do. Don't hurt yourself at work or even away from work, and you won't have to go through some of the things that me and Michael have to put up with on a daily basis.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
So I think we've covered it, Michael. I'm sure there's plenty more topics that we're going to discuss over the next weeks and months. So
yeah, sounds good.
Thanks again for your input and your experience, and we'll do this again.
Thanks, Woody. See you next time, buddy.
See you, mate.